Today I want to show all of you all my wildlife photography setup and give some tips and tricks on how you can get some great wildlife photography photos. What is going on, everyone? It's Rylan with Rylan's Amazing Photography, and today I want to give each and every one of you all, as I mentioned, a just full kind of guide to my wildlife photography setup. And I also want to talk about some tips and tricks as to how you all can get really good wildlife photos. It can be really challenging and really difficult, but before I get into the tips and tricks, I want to talk about my setup. Now, my setup is nothing that a beginner probably needs to go out and purchase. Everything that I use, it's probably, in total, all of my equipment it's probably about $6,000 total, and that's just a rough estimate. It's very possible that it's more around the $7,000 range, but that is nothing that people need to go out and spend all of their money on to begin with. So I want to start off talking about my setup by my camera. Now, I am currently using a Nikon D500. This used to be one of the best wildlife photography cameras. It was arguably the best wildlife photography cameras, and while I still strongly believe that this is definitely at the top of the wildlife photography game, it has been kind of knocked off that #1 slot by a lot of mirrorless cameras. The fact that this is still a DSLR. It's exceptional for wildlife and sports and other things. It gets 10 frames per second, which is something that a lot of cameras, even today, still are just not capable of doing. And that's exceptionally impressive for a DSLR camera. Now, something else that you're going to want to realize about this camera is it is a crop sensor camera. Crop sensor cameras have, things that aren't so great, but they also have their perks. One of the perks for crop sensor cameras, in my opinion, is for wildlife photography. Pairing a crop sensor camera with a full frame lens, which is what I do all the time, gives me an extra 1.5 times crop factor. Basically what that means is you're going to multiply the focal length that your lens is at by 1.5. So in theory, this is actually a 300 to, I believe it's a 750 focal length lens. That's just kind of an assumption right now. I can't remember exactly. And that's leading me into the next thing, which is my primary wildlife photography lens, and that is the Nikon 200-500 f5.6. It's been an outstanding lens. I've had it for quite a while now. I've gotten some really great photos with it, and it's really stepped my wildlife photography game up. And this is, if you've already got a camera and you're wanting to get into wildlife photography, before you do anything else, I think that you should get a wildlife photography lens. Now, that doesn't mean go out and spend $1,200 on a 200-500 millimeter, but get something like a 70-300 or a 70-200. That would also be a really good lens if you're working with something that's around the 18-55 focal length, which is what is traditionally the lens range for a starting kit lens. Now, something else that is really important that I want to talk about is a tripod. You can't really see my tripod. You can see my ball head and my camera and my lens, but what is going on below down here, I have a Xiaomi M6 tripod. This tripod was sent to me by a sponsor, and if it's something that you're interested in checking out, like if you want to see the video that I made on it, you can click right here. It's just kind of a basic tutorial. It's an older video, so it's not the greatest video, but it gives a good overview to the tripod and what all it's capable of. The Xiaomi M6 is durable. It's carbon fiber. It's not really that expensive. It's around $100, which is a really good price for a tripod that I think is as durable as this is. Is this going to last you 20 years? Probably not, but it's going to last you at least probably 5 to 8 years. And I mean, would you rather pay $700 to $900 for a tripod that's going to last you 20 years, or around $70 to $100 for a tripod that's going to last you 5 to 8 years? I would rather pay the lower amount personally. So what I have up here is a gimbal, and it's actually called a wildlife photography gimbal, And that's exactly what I use it for. The only time that I put this on my tripod is for wildlife photography. Now, this is a Neewer wildlife gimbal, and it is really durable, and I've had it for quite some time now as well. And there's a lot of wildlife gimbals that are like way up there in price range, like $300 or $400 just for the gimbal, which in my opinion is absolutely insane. This gimbal here is $70. I mean, you can tell I've given this thing quite a bit of beating, and it's really good quality. It's metal, I believe. I'm not sure, but it's really durable, and I definitely recommend getting this wildlife gimbal because it's just an exceptional gimbal. Not sponsored. So moving on, I am going to show you all this. This is my secondary camera. So it's a Nikon D3500. It was my very first camera. It got me quite a few wonderful shots. I think I even had an award-winning photo with this camera. Before I got the D500, I used to use the D3500 with the 200 to 500. Like I said, I recommend that you get a new lens before a new camera, and I did that, and I stand by my word. I think that was a smart decision on my part, even though I was still fairly new to photography. So on this D3500, I have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Now, this is an f2.8, which is allowing me to be a little more open and have a little more background blur than the 200 to 500 because it's only a 5.6. But this lens doesn't zoom as far as the 200 to 500. So if I'm ever in a situation where I'm in like a state park or a national park and I'm just kind of driving around and the animals aren't scared of you, let's say, for example, what I've used this on a lot in terms of wildlife is deer. Deer are not going to be particularly scared of you if you're in a state or national park, and that's because they're not allowed to be hunted there. So they get along fairly well with people, and they'll get fairly close to you without being scared. So in that instance, a 70 to 200 is really great. I also use this more if I'm in a low light scenario because I can really get that f-stop down, which is allowing more light to come into the camera. Now, I will say this, sometimes I use my primary camera, my D500, and my secondary camera, my D3500, together. And if that's ever happening, I always have the 200 to 500 on my D500 and my 70 to 200 on my D3500. And I know that's a lot of letters and numbers that I just threw at you all, but basically I'll have the small lens on my backup camera and the big lens on my main camera. Now that doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, that's what I'm doing, and that could be a scenario where I am driving around in a car and something might be far away or it might be close up, and if it was close up I would use the secondary, and if it's far away I'd use the primary. But that doesn't happen a lot. If I'm going on just like kind of a nice little walk and I'm on vacation or something, I'm probably going to pair the 70 to 200 with the D500 because I don't want to be walking through a city or through a trail with just this massive lens. People are gonna probably think you're crazy, and while I have did that sometimes, it's heavy to pack around for a 5-mile trip. So I would rather do the 70 to 200 and sacrifice focal length than to have to deal with packing around a 5-pound lens for 5 miles. So there's a little bit more that I want to talk to you all about in terms of gear. Something that is very important is camouflage. I'm going to come in closer for this. So when you're working with wildlife, you're going to want to have camo. That is so important. Animals are really apt to know what you're doing. Now I have camo gloves. I have 2 pairs of camo gloves actually. These, I can wear them, and if it's really cold outside, I can put them over my fingers like this. Or if it's, and if I'm needing to like adjust my camera settings, I can bring this down and then my fingers are available so I can adjust my settings or whatever. Then I also have just this regular pair of camo gloves. If it's really cold outside, I might wear these under the gloves that actually will come up and cover my fingers as well. Now I have this, I'm not sure what this is called. It goes over your head. I have a couple of these. This is the only camo one that I have. I also have a camo boggin that I find important. Something else camo that I just recently got here. I'm not sure what this is called. I call it Camo Wrap. What this does is, now this is a smaller piece that I cut off of a main big piece. And what I do with this is I'll put it over my lens. So my lens blends in with the surroundings. Obviously this is just me kind of placing it on there as an example, but you're gonna wanna kind of cover your lens really good, and you're not gonna wanna show any part of your lens, whether it be gray or black or whatever. The animals will probably catch on that shouldn't be there, so you can use that camo wrap to cover it. If you don't have camo clothes, they also have really big sheets of this that you can actually put over you, even if you are wearing camo. I think it's really smart. There's ghillie suits, there's a lot of different things camo that is smart to invest in when you're working with wildlife photography. As you can see, I'm now here at a blind here beside me. But before I talk about a blind, I want to clarify something real quick. Briefly, I talked about camo coverings as well as ghillie suits. That is not something that you're going to need if you are stationary in a blind. That is something that you would need if you were just kind of sitting out in the open, or if you're moving around doing wildlife photography is when you would use those things. So, when are you going to use a blind? What's it going to help you with? What are the advantages to it? Well, one of the biggest advantages of a blind is you're going to be able to get closer to an animal in a blind than you're ever going to be able to on foot, and that is a fact. That's not up for debate. There's no questioning that. It's obvious. I'm not going to be able to walk up 10 feet within a deer and take a picture. A deer will walk 10 feet within this blind. This blind has been here for years. The animals are acquainted with it. They're well aware of what is going on with this blind. They're not scared of it. They have no fear. They just act normal around it because they're used to it, which is a big advantage. When should you use a blind? I think if you're wanting to get closer to an animal and really get to learn about an animal and know about an animal more than you ever have previously, getting in a blind, preferably a stationary blind, is going to be the best option for you in terms of being able to get close. Now, this blind also offers other advantages, such as staying warm in the cold, not getting your scent to travel through the air. There's a lot of different things that being in a blind can do to help you be able to photograph animals. What I just talked about is pretty much the main advantages to being in a blind. Now, I also mentioned a portable blind. Now, I also have a portable blind that I use, but I don't use it anywhere near as much as I do a stationary blind like this. I have two main stationary blinds that I use. This is the one that I use the most. There's also another one on down. This one is really great for birds. The other one is greater for other kinds of wildlife. Now, there's all kinds of different wildlife that come to this one as well, but the other one doesn't really have birds. This one does. Now, a portable blind it's a debatable topic. Do they really help? Well, here's what I can tell you. A portable blind is going to conceal your presence. If an animal is there, they're not going to realize that you're there because the camo blind blends in with the surroundings. What does the animal know? The animal probably understands that there's something there that doesn't belong there, which is the blind. But that blind is going to help conceal your movements as well as your camera and your tripod and whatever you've got in the blind. Now, this can be a big blind, it can be a small blind. Portable blinds just aren't that great. A stationary blind like this, it's made of wood. It's got metal on it. It has windows and a door. It's not going anywhere. If you leave a portable blind out in the open for very long, I don't care how much you paid for it. I don't care how durable it is. It's gonna have a lot of damage from weather, whether that be rain, wind, sending it way off into the distance. It's just not as reliable as a stationary blind, in my opinion. I've gotten some really good pictures of birds and deer and turkey from portable blinds, but none of them are quite as good or quite as close as what they are in the stationary blind. The animals tend to be a little more skittish, a little more concerned that that blind is there than what they would be with the stationary blind like we have here. So next thing that I want to talk about is some tips and tricks and how to get really good photos of wildlife. That includes approaching the animal, how to get close, what should you know about the subject you're photographing before you try to get a good photo, how to identify an animal. There's a whole lot of tips and tricks that you need to know before you get a really good photo of an animal, and it's very important that you take into account things about the animal. So that's going to be the next topic that I get into. So what are my tips and tricks for photographing wildlife? Well, something that I want to start with is pretty much something that we've already covered, and that is being concealed, whether that be camo clothing, a ghillie suit, being in a stationary blind, being in a portable blind. It's important that the animal is not aware of your presence. Granted, there's times where the animal should be aware of your presence, but most of the time you're going to want to be concealed and blend in with the environment that you're in, whether that be snow, brush, whatever it is. It's important to blend in 99% of the time. Something else that I want to talk about is know your subject. That is extremely important. Now, I don't mean that you necessarily need to know everything about the bird, and there's nothing wrong with photographing a species that you're unfamiliar with. That happens to me sometimes. A bird will come out and I don't know what that bird is. I don't know much about the bird, but I still take a photo of it. Most birds and most animals follow this principle, and that is they don't know you, they don't like you, and you are a predator. And that's why you should stay concealed, because the animal is going to be scared of you. And in most situations, that's going to be the case. So what do you need to know about your subject? One of the most important things that I think you should know is, are they dangerous? Is the animal going to attack you if you get too close, if it spots you? That's extremely important. The next most important thing, in my opinion, it doesn't have anything to do with safety, it has to do with getting a good photo of them, and that is, what do they eat? If you set somewhere where you know that an animal is going to come to because there's food, you are way more likely to get a good photo of that animal than you would be just randomly finding a spot in the woods and sitting down. If you can find an animal trail, that's also good. You know that animals have been through that area. You can see that from tracks. You can see that they've kind of wore out a trail and a path through the woods or through the grass. Something else that can be handy is a game camera. This is a camera that you just kind of put on a tree, and it will take photos of the wildlife that passes in front of it. Something else that can be handy is bait. I don't have a problem with throwing corn out and throwing birdseed out for animals to eat and partake of. I've never saw anything wrong with that. Some people do. It's just a matter of opinion. If you do choose to do that, you don't want to get the animals necessarily relying on that as their only food source, because then if you stop putting out corn or stop putting out birdseed, they're not going to have anything to eat. And obviously they could die, or they might not be able to feed their young. It has effects on an animal when they're used to eating food and they can't get it anymore. So just be mindful of that if you do choose. There's a red-tailed hawk that is absolutely massive that's flying over me right now, and I don't have my camera, but it's fine. It's fine. It's a beautiful bird. Anyways, what is something else that you need to know about the animal? It's important to know their habitat. So you don't want to necessarily go to the rainforest and say that you want to find a white-tailed deer, because that's just not logical. White-tailed deer don't live in rainforests. They live in regular forests. They live in the woods. They live in grasslands. You're not going to find a white-tailed deer in the rainforest. Something else that you want to keep in mind when photographing wildlife is your camera settings. If you're photographing a subject that is very active and fidgety and could be running or moving, you're going to want to keep a high shutter speed. If you're dealing with an animal that's running or flying and they're just really fast, typically the lowest shutter speed that I'm going to be at is 1/800th of a second. There are more things to do with camera settings than just shutter speed though, and you need to keep all the things in mind. You need to keep everything that you know about photography in mind. F-stop, ISO, lens focal length, camera selection, lens selection, all of that is important. You don't want to be photographing a subject in the middle of the day with ISO 2000 because the image is going to be grainy and it's going to be really bright, and there's just no point in that when you could lower your ISO and something like that. It's just important to keep in mind everything that you need to know about photography. I mean, you don't want to just keep in mind shutter speed. That's really important, but I don't want to be photographing a deer and then accidentally focus on its nose and everything else be out of focus because I'm at f2.8. If I'm photographing a deer, I'm going to want to be at f8, f7.1, f5.6, something that's going to keep the whole face in focus. Because if you misfocus just the slightest bit and you're at f2.8, the whole image is ruined. You got to be mindful about things like that. There are some situations and some scenarios where it is better if the subject knows that you're there. If you're photographing something like a bear, or I don't know, if you're on an African safari and there's a lion or there's a tiger, I think it's important for them to know that you're there, especially if they're comfortable with people. I've seen a lot of people in areas like Alaska where they're photographing a grizzly bear and it's just like 20 to 30 feet in front of them, and they're just constantly talking to it. They're making sure that they are aware that they're making sure that the bear is aware of their presence and that they're there and that they're not a threat. And that's really important because you don't want to like try to conceal yourself in front of a grizzly bear, because if it's not aware that you're there and then it all of the sudden becomes aware that you're there and you're kind of spying on it, it's probably going to take you as a predator and it might try to attack you, which will be an unfortunate situation for not only you but the bear as well. So it's important to sometimes let the subject know that you're there and that you're not a threat. One of the most popular questions that I get is, how do I get so close to animals? One of which is something that I've already discussed, which is photo blinds. Getting in a blind and just kind of being patient and waiting on an animal to show up and just be natural in its own habitat. But that's not always possible. Sometimes you have to take the initiative to approach the animal yourself. And when doing that, it's important to keep some things in mind. The first of which is, what is the animal? Is it dangerous? Your safety is more important than the safety of any animal, and the safety of the people around you are also important. But after your own safety, before you're concerned about getting a photo or anything else, the animal is your utmost priority. You don't want to disturb an animal in its natural habitat, whether it is dangerous or not. So the way that I like to approach animals is simple. If they're aware I'm there, I do not take constant steps toward the animal. I do not run towards the animal. In fact, what I do is I will take about 3 to 5 steps at a time, and I never do it directly towards the animal. I will do it diagonally towards the animal where I'm still moving closer, but I'm not directly approaching it. If the animal is not aware that I'm there, things can get a little more complicated, because if it suddenly becomes aware that I'm there, it's going to be spooked and most likely leave and quit what they're doing. So I will get on the ground and I will army crawl, and I use the same principle that I use for walking towards a subject that's totally aware I'm there, and that is I will crawl 3 or 5 good, I guess, like strokes and pushes and whatnot, and I do not crawl directly towards the animal. I will crawl diagonal to the animal where I'm still getting closer, but I'm not directly approaching them, so they don't pick up on my scent or they don't see me if they're not aware that I'm there. So how do you identify an animal? If you've spotted an animal and you don't know what the species is or what the general animal is, in today's times it is easier to find that out than ever before. While there are thousands and thousands of books that are going to be animal identification and different things like that, that's going to show you and allow you to flip through pages at all the individual animals, that's not necessarily the best way to do things in 2021. The internet is right at your fingertips. There are hundreds upon hundreds of apps that you can just use to identify a species or an animal. And if you don't want to get an app, you can do a reverse Google image search. I mean, that works on anything, even tracks. I have identified tracks using reverse Google image search of animals. And that's exceptionally handy. You can just put the image in Google and it'll reverse the search, and then it'll like pop up and say coyote, which is so handy because sometimes tracks can be confusing and they all don't always look the same. So to close up this video, I want to say that you need to be familiar with the gear that you are using. You don't need to go out in the field with a brand new camera and expect to get an award-winning shot the first day. It's important to familiarize yourself with all of the buttons on your camera and what each and every one of those buttons will do if you press it out in the field. You need to be ready to change shutter speed like that, change aperture like that, change ISO like that, change your focus point like that, change your focus mode like that. There are a whole lot of different things that you need to be able to do in a split second, and going out in the field with a brand new camera is not going to be the smartest decision. So with that being said, that is all that I have for today's video. If it helped you out, I would really appreciate if you would go down below and like the video as well as subscribe. I have a video come out every Friday, and we're pretty close to 1,000 subscribers. I'm getting really excited. At the point of filming this, we are actually under 200 subscribers to get to 1,000. We have less than 200 to go. If you want to help support me in other ways, I also have a print store. You can go down below and press the link in the description, or you can go to my website, www.rylandsamazingphotography.com, to find out more information about my prints and my book that I also sell. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. What's your favorite tip? What is your favorite thing about my setup? Did you learn something? Because the whole reason I made this video is to teach and to help photographers who are doing wildlife already or who are looking to get into wildlife photography. So if I helped you, the goal of this video was met. Thanks again so much for watching, and I hope you guys have an amazing day.